State of the Union in 1900. What's the situation? What are the problems? What are the challenges? What are the new developments in the United States at the turn of the century as we go from the 1800s to the 1900s? For one, the West is all settled. By 1900, many Americans consider the national goal of manifest destiny, of stretching from sea to shining sea, Atlantic to the Pacific, completed and done. The 1890 census, in fact, declares that the American frontier was closed. In other words, most of the land out west is settled. There are, for all intents and purposes, by 1900, no more wide open spaces for many Americans. In 1900, we also have dramatically increasing industrial production. In fact, that growth started shortly after the Civil War in 1865, and it was a direct result of improvements in things like communication. Right here, we see a telegraph device used before the telephone to communicate across huge distances. That industrial production also increased as a result of improvements in transportation, not the least of which was miles and miles and miles of more railroad tracks being built in this time period, making it easier to get raw materials and finished goods around the country. It's also a direct result of increases in technology. Technological improvements like the Bessemer process, diagrammed here, which made steel production cheaper and more efficient and stronger steel produced. Improvements in technology and processes also lead to increased industrial production. And it wasn't a small increase. From 1865, the end of the Civil War, until 1900, U.S. industrial production increased by 6 times. The United States is making 6 times as much stuff by 1900 as they were at the end of the Civil War. The textile industry, making fabric for clothing, is the first to industrialize. In fact, it industrialized before the Civil War. But even the textile industry continues to grow as it spreads into the American South after the Civil War. We also see the growth of the iron and steel industry, along with the railroad industry and a number of other industries. All of this increased industrial production leads companies to increase their sales efforts. As American businesses are making more and more stuff, they need to find a way to sell more and more of that stuff to more and more Americans and people outside of the country. Mail order catalogs were one way companies tried to do that. Sears and Roebuck being the most famous of the mail order companies. In the Sears and Roebuck catalog, Americans could order everything from rifles and shotguns to automobiles to even houses. My grandmother grew up in a house in Delaware, Ohio, that was purchased from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. To increase sales, we also see the rise, or the birth really, of department stores. And these were not small department stores. These were huge department stores. Macy's was one of the first ones, along with Marshall Field's. And I think this is Marshall Field's here in the picture. We also see the birth of chain stores, smaller stores, but stores that are almost identical from location to location to location in cities all across a state, and for big companies like Woolworths, all the way across the country. As industry grew, so did American cities. In 1800, only 6% of Americans lived in cities. But by 1900, that number had increased to 40%. American cities are growing along with American industry. Cities were very popular for many people. They were especially popular for immigrants. Not only were there jobs available, but there was community available. This is a picture of Little Italy around the turn of the century. So just about everybody we see in that picture there probably speaks Italian. They probably follow many of the same traditions and cultural norms that people in Italy followed. So Italian immigrants knew that there was a part of New York City where they could live and continue to be able to buy the foods and clothing that they had gotten used to growing up in Italy, continuing to celebrate the holidays that they got used to celebrating in Italy, continuing to worship as they did in Italy, continuing to speak as they did in Italy. So the community offered by urban neighborhoods was a big draw. The same was true for African Americans. By the turn of the century, we start to see African Americans moving out of the South and moving to the North, and especially to urban areas, as that's where the jobs were. That's going to really accelerate, though, in what we call the Great Migration, and that doesn't really start until about World War I. As I said, jobs were a big draw for the cities. Not just jobs in factories, too. The cities also offer a lot of other jobs, like working on a dock as a stevedore or longshoreman. That's what these guys are doing. That's a job that you really only find in a city where there's a large harbor. The cities also offered entertainment in the form of theaters. And one of the popular theater attractions at the time were called vaudeville shows. Think of a variety show, but there's no host to introduce each act, and there is no connection between the previous act and the next act. So you might go from a strongman performance, a guy lifting impossibly heavy weights, to a woman singing opera, to some clowns, to a lion tamer, to a Shakespearean actor performing a scene from the Scottish play. That's what vaudeville was. If you didn't like the performer that was on at the time, well, it's going to change in just a few minutes. The cities also offered circuses. Well, circuses traveled around the country, but they stopped in the cities because that's where they could stay for a couple of days and draw large crowds. They stopped in small towns too, but especially in the cities. And Barnum and Bailey's circus performances were some of the most popular of the time. Cities also offered spectator sports like football and baseball and boxing, and baseball probably the most popular among those. As the cities grew, so did the buildings in the cities. We already mentioned the huge department stores that would cover sometimes more than an entire city block. This is the Macy's building in Chicago. Now, the picture it's from a little bit later, but that's how big it was originally. These department stores could be huge in some of the big urban areas. We also see the rich and wealthy class building their mansions in or practically in the cities. They're not going to build them right next to the factory. They're going to build them in the nicest neighborhoods in the cities and maybe take the trolley car to get into the heart of downtown when they want to. But we're going to see the wealthy living in the cities, not way out in the country on some huge estate, but in large mansions in the urban areas because that's where people wanted to be. And if we're going to talk about the growth of buildings, we should definitely mention skyscrapers. Improvements in concrete and steel and construction allow American architects and engineers and construction crews to start building the first skyscrapers at this time. One of the early ones was the Flatiron Building seen here from New York City. Another trend around the turn of the century, around 1900, is America is an increasingly diverse nation. Our country has always been a nation of immigrants. It's from 1870 to 1920, though, where we become an even more diverse nation of immigrants. From 1870 to 1920, overall, we have a booming economy. There are ups and downs. There are panics or depressions in 1873 and 1893, and then I think again in 1913 maybe. But overall, the economy is doing really well. When the economy is doing well, immigration to America increases. If we had a graphing the U.S. economy over those same years, we would see the economy almost perfectly mirror this graph of immigration. By 1910, more than half of the population in most American cities, big cities like New York and Chicago and Cleveland, more than half of the population in those big cities were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. They were first-generation Americans. In fact, over half of the industrial workforce were born outside of the United States. Now, immigration was not a new phenomenon to the United States. Before the Civil War, we saw significant immigration, again, when the economy was up, but it was immigration from Northern and Western Europe primarily. We saw large numbers of immigrants coming to America before the Civil War from Ireland and from England itself and from Germany, and to a lesser extent from the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden. Northern and Western European immigrants made up the bulk of immigrants to America before the Civil War. After the Civil War, it's going to be immigrants from Southern and from Eastern Europe that are going to make up huge groups coming to the United States. So we're talking about people from Italy and people to a lesser extent from Greece. We're talking about large numbers of people from Russia and other Eastern European countries or regions like Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Romania. These countries are sending, or rather a lot of people are leaving these countries and for a variety of reasons and coming to the United States. We also see large numbers of immigrants coming across the Pacific, people coming from China as well as Japan. Now, this is going to stop almost entirely in 1882 with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we even see an increase during prosperous economic times of immigrants coming up from Mexico and immigrants coming down from Canada. So, immigration creates an even more diverse nation in this time period when the cities are growing and when industry is thriving, all the while after the West is almost completely settled. That's the state of America in 1900.